All right, so we are moving along here through time, and we are getting to about the 1800s. And I'm sort of breaking these down at the century mark at this point because things are kind of progressing more quickly through time as you get closer to present day. And something that we see in the 1800s is that we're starting to see sort of something that resembles what we might call actual urban forestry and how vegetation and trees specifically are showing up in cities in ways that they kind of look familiar to how we have them today. And so trees are appearing in cities at a larger scale. We see trees lining streets in the city of Paris, and this influences other cities around the world at this time. We see the evolution of large parks, and there's also more expanding on this plant hunting and exploration as technology and transportation methods improve. People are moving around more, and they're taking plants with them, and we're exploring what's left of the new world, and sort of expanding into new areas. And so we're coming across new species and bringing those back and things like that. And that sort of invigorates people and gets people curious about plants and inspires some of that. And so, here's some examples of some boulevards in Paris where, they're actually planting trees along these streets and basically, essentially having street trees at that point. And those sorts of things in Europe eventually spread across Europe and into the United States in our cities here as well. And another interesting thing that happened pretty much exclusively here in the United States is that there were in the 1800s, as people were sort of expanding across the continental United States. Um, we have one thing we have a need for pretty much wherever there are humans is that there has to be some way. What you do with your loved ones that have passed on, and so it's kind of an interesting relationship between cemeteries in the United States and urban forestry. And what happened here was that in the early part of the 19th century, there was this movement, the rural cemetery movement, as the cemeteries were being constructed and laid out in rural United States. The sort of walking paths and roads through the cemeteries and leading up to the cemeteries would be lined with trees. And people, if you're visiting if you're visiting your loved ones or ancestors that have passed on, you want to have sort of an environment that's sort of welcoming and pleasing. And you want to kind of, I think people want to have this idea where their loved ones are being laid to rest as, an area that's nice to look at. It's pretty, and you can sort of envision them resting in that sort of space. And so I think that sort of led into this like idea of having cemeteries sort of like almost like parks. They don't function like parks, but the way that we're planting trees in them and things. But what is interesting about this is this actually inspired people to start incorporating trees into their regular environments. And so there were trees in cemeteries, and people were like, "Oh, this is actually kind of nice." Like it's kind of morbid sometimes to be in a cemetery, but like the environment's kind of nice. There's trees and stuff around, kind of looks like a park. And so people are like, "What if we just did this in other places too?" And so an example, it was kind of called the rural cemetery movement. But an example of this is Riverside, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, and is usually cited as an early example where they were sort of inspired by these sorts of layouts where they have trees throughout the landscape and sort of integrating them into the environment. Not instead of just a park like let's just plant trees around the neighborhood. And sort of beautify the area and green up the area in that way. And so a lot of United States or some United States suburbs were inspired by this rural cemetery movement, which is kind of interesting, and not something I really was aware of until I started looking into this stuff. Something else that was going on during this time period is you may be familiar with the holiday. I don't know if it's like a national, like a recognized holiday. It's Arbor Day, and it's basically if you've never heard of what Arbor Day is, it's just a day where people sort of celebrate trees, and lots of cities do tree giveaways, and they're trying to encourage people to plant more trees. And it's been a United States um, holiday, not like a holiday you're gonna get off work or anything, but it's a day that we recognize, and it started in the early 1880s. It's kind of an interesting story. I'm not gonna really get into it here, but it started sort of in two different areas. People had the same sort of idea, and they weren't. I don't think they were both calling it Arbor Day, but they were doing the same sort of thing within like a couple of years' time in Nebraska and independently in Ohio, and they were really popular. They were kind of like school. They'd have schools celebrate these things. So like kids, in school would all like get together and they would have a celebration. They'd go out to parks and they'd plant trees, and their parents would be there and they'd just hang out. And it was a really popular thing, and sort of spread. And it continues. Like we still celebrate Arbor Day. And like I said, lots of cities will have some sort of recognition of this day and do something. But that traces us all the way back to the 1880s. So there was a lot of stuff happening in the 1800s, and things that were starting to modernize urban forestry. And when we get into the 1900s, so we're going to transition here in the 1900s. Some of that momentum came with the turn of the century here, and so there was a number of things that sort of spiraled off that backbone of the 1800s. So there was the development. One of these was the development of the field of arboriculture, and we're going to talk more about arboriculture, but just so you understand, it's sort of the science of how you take care of trees in landscapes and urban settings. So like, how do you properly plant a tree? There's like a scientific way of how you should plant a tree. And that depends on where you're planting it and the surrounding environment and stuff. But there's also things like, how should you prune a tree? How do you make those cuts? What's the proper way to prune a tree if it's growing in an urban environment and you need to sort of shape it or move it? What's the proper way to remove a tree? How do you um, fertilize and water trees? And like, how do you prevent pests? Or what do you do if you have some sort of beetle or infestation on your tree? So that all of those things are sort of the field of arboriculture, sort of a subfield of horticulture almost. So that sort of came to be in the early 1900s. There was also the City Beautiful movement, which was probably built off this backbone where there was some of that was coming out of the things that were going on in the 1800s, and there was this group of architects and city planners that they wanted the cities to look nice. We had these modern cities that were starting to sprawl out, and in the United States, and people were moving to urban areas for jobs, and cities were expanding, and so people wanted the cities to actually look nice. And so the City Beautiful movement was a movement within the United States to incorporate. Some of it wasn't, some of it was just like, how can we design better cities? But some of it was also, how can we incorporate, plants and vegetation into cities to help improve the citizens' day-to-day lives. And then there was also the rise of environmentalism. So, and this kind of spirals into a lot of things. There's deforestation that was happening at this time, and the environmentalism movement sort of rose up in challenge of that. But it wasn't limited to just deforestation of forested areas. There was environmentalism where people wanted nature to be part of their everyday lives, and so there were more tree plantings going on. So there's all this stuff sort of going on at the same time around the turn of the century and into the 19th century. And these would probably be things that we would associate with increase in tree plantings and more dense urban canopies. But there's also sort of two sides of this coin to what was going on in the 1900s. So there were those things, but there was also, cities were expanding. The United States was sort of developing, becoming more modern, and places were coming more developed. And to accommodate that, there needed to be more streets. Streets and transportation was taking off. Cars were, showing up, and more people were driving, so streets needed to be widened. And when you put in streets, you're usually clearing out trees, And when you're widening streets, you're usually clearing out, if there are trees, you're going to cut those down and they get damaged. So those sorts of things were, lots of trees were actually being removed also, and especially into the latter half of this century, sort of the middle part of the 1900s. And then also the expansion of utility lines. The power grid was modernized in a historical context anyway, and we were able to transport energy. But to do this, you need to clear a lot of space for utility lines, and so that was the cause of a lot of deforestation as well. There were the World Wars, the World War I, World War II also, which is worth mentioning, contributing to a lot of that was conflict, and as we already talked about, people cut down trees for resources during times of conflict. But there were also some other things that happened. So there were a number of diseases and pests that came through, and so I'm going to have you do a reading about the American chestnut and chestnut blight. And there were other things. There were a number of pests, forest pests that come through, and those tend to be really destructive. One for our environment, is based on a lot of now, especially urban forests, but also the fact that we get so many resources from forests, and so those can be, when those pests come through, they can be really really destructive. So we'll take a look at that. And so there were sort of it was two sides of the same coin in the 1900s, where you had that City Beautiful movement, environmentalism, alongside all these other things that were going on that were sort of decreasing the amount of trees present. So it was an interesting time period. And that sort of leads us up to where we are now. So I'm not going to get too much into. There's other stuff that we could talk about, like recent history in terms of urban forestry, but I'm going to incorporate that stuff more into some of the stuff that we talk about. So I'm going to wrap it up here, and just something to think about is that we still see a lot of these patterns, like even looking back, like we just looked back through almost as much of human history as we could cover here. We see a lot of patterns that repeat themselves, and so trees are in urban vegetation have similar uses over time. Like we still plant trees in orchards and stuff, and in urban environments, and people have been sitting in the shade of trees since the humans existed. And we still cut down trees when we need them, and plant them during times when we kind of want things to be nicer. And so it's sort of a story of humanity where you get these cycles over and over again. And so something to think about as we go forward, and we talk more about how urban forests function and how we're using them. These aren't necessarily always new ideas, and the past tends to repeat itself. So something to think about. Anyway, this is the last lecture video, but just a reminder, there is other stuff in the module, so you're not done with the module yet. So keep working your way through that. Hope your second week has been going well. Email me if you have any questions, or shoot me a message on Canvas. Let me know. Otherwise, I'll be back with more lecture videos next week. Thanks.